The dust from the wagon train had barely settled on Zelda O'Connell's dress when she noticed the cowboy watching her from across the clearing, his dark eyes reflecting something she could not quite name in the fading Arizona sun. It was late August in 1883, and the wagon train had stopped just outside Globe, a mining town nestled in the rough country of Gila County, where copper veins ran deep and opportunities supposedly ran deeper. The journey from Missouri had been long and arduous, filled with prairie crossings and river fords that tested every traveler's resolve. Zelda was headed to California with her aunt and uncle, chasing the promise of orange groves and a fresh start after her parents had died from fever the previous winter. She was 22 years old, possessed of auburn hair that refused to stay properly pinned beneath her bonnet, and green eyes that her mother had always said could see straight through to a person's truth. Right now, those eyes were focused on inventory, counting the supplies they would need for the final leg of their journey. The train master had announced they would rest here for 3 days before continuing west through some of the most challenging terrain yet. "Miss O'Connell," a voice said, and she turned to find the cowboy who had been watching her now standing close enough that she could see the dust coating his hat and the stubble shadowing his jaw. He was tall and lean, built like someone who spent his days in the saddle, and he removed his hat with a practiced motion that suggested good upbringing beneath the rough exterior. "Yes?" Zelda asked, noting how his dark hair curled slightly at his temples, damp with sweat from the day's heat. "Name's Jackson Northwood. I work the Triple Bar Ranch about 10 miles south of here. I could not help but notice your wagon has a cracked axle on the rear left side. You planning to fix that before you head into the Superstition Range?" Zelda frowned and moved quickly to examine where he indicated, her practical nature overriding any concern about propriety. He was right. A thin fracture ran along the wood, barely visible but undeniably there. If it gave way in the mountains, they could lose the entire wagon and everything in it. "I had not seen that," she admitted, straightening and brushing dust from her hands. "Thank you for pointing it out. I will tell my uncle immediately." "Your uncle, the gray-haired fellow with the limp?" Jackson asked, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, that is Uncle Robert. He injured his leg in a farming accident years ago." "Why do you ask?" Jackson shifted his weight, glancing toward where the wagons were circling for the night. "No disrespect intended, but that axle needs a full replacement, not just a patch job. It requires strength and knowledge of woodwork. I have been repairing ranch equipment for the better part of 6 years. If you would like, I could help." There was something in his tone, a sincerity that made Zelda pause. She had grown wary during the journey west, learning quickly that not everyone offered help without expecting something in return. But Jackson Northwood's eyes held no calculation, just a straightforward honesty that reminded her of her father. "That is very kind, Mr. Northwood. I would need to speak with my uncle first, of course. We have little money to pay for such work." "Did not ask for payment," Jackson replied simply. "Just offering help to travelers. This country is hard enough without broken axles making it harder." Before Zelda could respond, her Aunt Margaret called from the wagon circle, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant she had noticed Zelda talking to a strange man and did not approve. Zelda excused herself and hurried back, feeling Jackson's gaze follow her across the dusty ground. That evening, as the wagon train settled in for the night and cook fires dotted the landscape like fallen stars, Uncle Robert inspected the axle with a borrowed lantern and confirmed what Jackson had said. The wood was compromised and would likely fail in the mountains. He stood with difficulty, his bad leg clearly paining him after the long day's travel. "We will need to find someone in Globe who can fix it," he said, his weathered face creased with worry. "Though I doubt we can afford much, and if it takes longer than 3 days, the train will leave without us." "A cowboy offered to help," Zelda ventured. "He seemed to know what he was talking about." Aunt Margaret, stirring a pot of beans over the fire, made a disapproving sound. "A strange cowboy." "Absolutely not, Zelda. We do not know anything about him." "We do not know anything about anyone here," Zelda pointed out, keeping her voice respectful but firm. "And he did not ask for payment. He was just trying to help." Uncle Robert rubbed his bearded chin thoughtfully. "What was his name?" "Jackson Northwood. He said he works at the Triple Bar Ranch." Recognition flickered across her uncle's face. "I have heard of that spread. Good reputation from what the other men were saying. Large operation, runs several hundred head of cattle. If he works there, he likely knows his way around repairs." He paused, then nodded slowly. "If he is still willing tomorrow, I will accept his help. We cannot afford to break down in the mountains with winter coming on." The next morning arrived with that particular clarity of light that belonged only to the Arizona Territory, sharp and golden and almost painfully bright. Zelda was helping her aunt prepare breakfast when Jackson appeared, leading a sturdy-looking horse and carrying tools wrapped in oiled cloth. He greeted Uncle Robert with a firm handshake and got to work immediately, assessing the damage in the growing daylight. Zelda found herself watching him as she went about her morning tasks, noting the efficient way he moved, the careful consideration he gave to measuring and cutting the replacement, what he had brought from town. He had purchased it with his own money, he explained when her uncle protested, and would not hear of being reimbursed. "Consider it a welcome to Arizona," Jackson said with a slight smile that transformed his serious face into something warmer. "We are not all desert and danger out here." As the morning progressed and the heat built like a physical presence, Zelda brought water to where Jackson worked beneath the wagon. He accepted it gratefully, drinking deep before wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You planning to settle in California?" he asked, a question that seemed casual but which Zelda sensed held more weight than the words suggested. "That is the plan. My aunt and uncle have family there with an orange farm. They have offered us work and a place to stay." "That sounds real nice," Jackson said, but something in his tone had flattened, lost its earlier warmth. He returned to his work with renewed focus, and Zelda felt an unexpected disappointment at the shift. She returned to her own tasks, helping Aunt Margaret with mending and sorting through their supplies. But her attention kept drifting back to the man beneath their wagon, to the play of muscle beneath his sun-darkened skin as he worked, to the careful competence of his hands. It was not proper, she knew, to study a man so openly. But there was something about Jackson Northwood that pulled at her in a way she could not quite explain. By afternoon, he had removed the damaged axle and was fitting the new one, a process that required precision and strength. Uncle Robert tried to help, but his leg gave him trouble. And eventually, Jackson suggested, with great tact, that perhaps the older man could be more useful supervising the angle while Jackson handled the heavy lifting. It was a kindness, Zelda realized, allowing her uncle to feel useful without straining his injury. "You are good at that," she said when Jackson took a break, seeking shade beneath the wagon's canvas cover. "At what?" he asked, accepting another dipper of water. "At making people feel valued. You could have done this faster alone, but you let my uncle help." Jackson looked at her for a long moment, and Zelda felt heat that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun spread through her chest. "A man's pride is worth something," he said finally. "Especially when age or injury takes other things from him. Seemed important to let him feel he was still protecting his family." It was such a simple statement, but it revealed depths of understanding that surprised her. Most of the men she had known back in Missouri had been concerned primarily with their own standing, their own achievements. This cowboy, with his dusty clothes and calloused hands, seemed to see the world through a more generous lens. "Where did you learn to think that way?" she asked before she could stop herself. Jackson's expression grew distant. "My father died when I was 16, kicked by a horse and never recovered. I watched him struggle with not being able to work, not being able to provide. It ate at him worse than the injury. I learned then that sometimes what a man needs is not pity but purpose." "I am sorry about your father," Zelda said softly. "It was a long time ago now. I am 25, been on my own more years than not." He studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What about you? You said your parents passed. That recent, last winter. The fever took them within days of each other." The words still hurt to say, even months later. "Aunt Margaret and Uncle Robert took me in, insisted I come west with them. I had no other family, nowhere else to go." "That must have been hard," Jackson said. And the simple acknowledgement, without platitudes or awkward condolences, somehow meant more than all the carefully worded sympathy she had received from others. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, two people who had known loss finding an unexpected understanding. Then Jackson set down his water and returned to work, and Zelda went back to her aunt, feeling as though something had shifted in the space between them. Some invisible line had been crossed. That evening, the Wagon train's camp came alive with music and conversation, as people took advantage of the rest day to socialize. Someone had a fiddle, and couples danced in the firelight while children ran shrieking between the wagons. Jackson had finished the repair work earlier, refusing Uncle Robert's repeated attempts to pay him, and Zelda had assumed he would return to his ranch. Instead, he lingered at the edge of the camp, watching the festivities with a wistful expression. Zelda found herself drawn to where he stood as though pulled by an invisible thread. "Not a dancer?" she asked, appearing at his elbow. He turned, surprise and pleasure mingling on his face. "Never learned properly. Ranch work does not leave much time for social graces." "I find that hard to believe. You have been nothing but gracious since we met." "That is different from knowing how to dance," Jackson said, but there was a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It is not so difficult," Zelda said, emboldened by something she could not name. "The music tells you what to do if you listen." She held out her hand, a gesture so forward that Aunt Margaret would have been scandalized had she seen. Jackson looked at her outstretched fingers for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, took her hand in his. His palm was rough with work, warm and strong, and Zelda felt that touch all the way to her bones. They moved to where other couples were dancing, and Zelda showed him the basic steps of a reel. He was awkward at first, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but he learned quickly, his natural athleticism serving him well. By the second dance, they were moving together with an ease that felt both new and ancient, as though they had been dancing together for years rather than minutes. "You are a good teacher," Jackson said, his face closer to hers than propriety strictly allowed. "You are a good student," Zelda replied, breathless not from the exertion but from his proximity, from the way his hand rested at her waist, from the warmth in his dark eyes. The fiddle player transitioned into a slower tune, and couples drew closer together. Jackson pulled Zelda nearer, and she went willingly, resting her hand on his shoulder and feeling the solid strength of him beneath her fingers. They swayed together, barely moving, and the rest of the world seemed to fall away until there was only this man, this moment, this inexplicable connection. "Miss O'Connell," Jackson said, his voice low and rough, "I need to tell you something." "Zelda," she corrected. Please call me Zelda." "Zelda," he repeated, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. "I know we just met yesterday. I know it does not make any logical sense. But I cannot let you leave on that wagon train without telling you that I have never felt this way before, never felt this certainty about another person." Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could feel it. "Certainty about what? That you are meant to stay here, that California is the wrong direction, that everything I have been working toward, everything I have been building, it was all waiting for you." He took a shaky breath. "I know how that sounds. I know you must think me crazy or foolish or both." Zelda should have pulled away, should have been alarmed by such intensity from a man she barely knew. But instead, she found herself gripping his shoulder tighter, anchoring herself to him. "I do not think you are crazy," she whispered. "I think I have been feeling the same thing and did not know how to name it." They stopped moving entirely now, standing in the middle of the dancing couples, lost in each other. "Then stay," Jackson said urgently. "Do not get on that wagon train. Stay here in Globe, stay with me. I cannot just leave my aunt and uncle. They are the only family I have left. I know. I am not asking you to abandon them. I am just asking you to consider another path. Globe needs good people. There are opportunities here, ways your uncle could make a living without the hardship of continuing west. And you." He cupped her face gently with one calloused hand. "You could have a home here. A real home, not just a place at the end of a difficult journey." "This is madness," Zelda said, but she did not move away from his touch. "We have known each other barely 2 days. Sometimes 2 days is enough. Sometimes you just know." His thumb traced her cheekbone, a feather-light touch that sent shivers through her despite the warm night. "But I will not push you. I just needed you to know that if you want a reason to stay, I am here. I will be here. And I will wait as long as it takes for you to be sure." The music ended, and the spell broke slightly as couples separated and applauded the fiddler. Jackson dropped his hand from her face, but held her gaze for a long moment, before stepping back and creating proper distance between them. "Think about it," he said quietly. "The wagon train leaves in 2 days. That is time enough to be sure one way or another." He left then, disappearing into the darkness beyond the firelight, and Zelda stood alone, her world tilted on its axis, everything she thought she knew suddenly uncertain. That night, Zelda lay awake in the wagon bed while her aunt and uncle slept, staring at the canvas cover above her and replaying every moment with Jackson Northwood. It was insane to even consider his suggestion. She had known him for less than 48 hours. What kind of woman stayed behind with a strange man, abandoning her family and the security of a planned future? But even as she catalogued all the reasons why Jackson's proposal was impossible, her heart kept whispering that it was not strange at all, that she knew him in some fundamental way that transcended time. The connection she felt was not just attraction, though there was certainly that. It was recognition, as though some part of her had been waiting for him without knowing it. She must have eventually dozed because she woke to find sunlight streaming through gaps in the canvas and the sounds of the camp stirring to life. It was the second day of their rest stop. Tomorrow, the wagon train would depart for California, and Zelda would have to make a choice that would determine the course of her entire life. She dressed quickly and climbed out of the wagon to find her uncle already up, testing his weight on the repaired axle. The work Jackson had done was flawless. The new wood fitted perfectly and reinforced with iron brackets that had not been there before. "That cowboy did fine work," Uncle Robert said, running his hand appreciatively over the smooth joints. "Better than fine, actually. This axle is stronger than the original. We should be able to make it to California without any problems now." Zelda felt her stomach twist at the certainty in his voice. Uncle Robert, can I ask you something? Of course, my dear. Why did you decide to go to California? What made you choose that destination over anywhere else? Her uncle considered the question, leaning against the wagon. Your aunt's brother made it sound promising in his letters. Work available, good climate, chance to be part of something growing. But truthfully, Zelda, it could have been anywhere. After the farm failed back home, we just needed a fresh start somewhere. California seemed as good as anywhere else. So it was not about California specifically. It was just about leaving Missouri and starting over. I suppose that is accurate, yes. He studied her face with growing concern. Why do you ask? Are you having doubts about the journey? Before Zelda could answer, Aunt Margaret appeared with breakfast and the moment for confession passed. But throughout the meal, she could feel her uncle's eyes on her, thoughtful and questioning. The morning was spent on various preparations for departure. Zelda volunteered to walk into Globe proper to purchase some final supplies, eager for time alone to think. The town was rough and ready, built around the copper mines that had drawn people to this harsh country. False-fronted buildings lined the main street, and the constant sound of mining equipment echoed from the surrounding hills. She was examining fabric at the general store when a woman's voice spoke behind her. You are with the Wagon train, are you not? Zelda turned to find a woman perhaps 10 years her senior with kind eyes and capable hands. Yes, I am. How did you know? Small town and strangers are noticed. The woman extended her hand. I am Ruth Palmer. My husband runs the newspaper here. Zelda shook her hand, introducing herself. Ruth had a forthright manner that invited confidence, and soon they were talking as Ruth helped Zelda select supplies and shared information about Globe. It is a good town, Ruth said, measuring out thread. Rough around the edges, certainly, but there are decent people here trying to build something lasting. We have a school now and a church, and more families arriving every month. It is not civilized like back east, but it is getting there. Do you ever regret coming here? Zelda asked impulsively. Ruth paused, considering. There are hard days when I miss my family back in Pennsylvania, when the dust storms blow or the summer heat feels unbearable. But no, I do not regret it. My husband and I built a life here together. We have 2 children who know how to be strong, how to work hard, how to appreciate what they have. That would not have happened in a city where everything came easy. What if you had not come with your husband? What if you had to choose between him and your family? Understanding dawned in Ruth's eyes, and she set down the thread to give Zelda her full attention. You met someone. It was not a question, and Zelda found herself nodding. The cowboy who repaired our wagon. It sounds foolish saying it aloud. I have known him barely 2 days. Jackson Northwood, Ruth said with a knowing smile. I heard he was helping your wagon train. That man has one of the best reputations in the county. Honest, hardworking, treats everyone fair. Half the unmarried women in town have set their caps for him, but he never showed interest in anyone. Until now, apparently. Zelda felt her cheeks warm. He asked me to stay, to not continue to California. And what does your heart tell you to do? My heart is not being rational. Hearts rarely are, Ruth said gently, but that does not make them wrong. I chose to come west with William when my entire family said I was making a mistake. 12 years later, I can tell you it was the best decision I ever made. But only you can know what is right for you, Zelda. What I will say is this. Globe could use more women like you. We are building something here, and it takes courage and strength. If you decided to stay, you would find a community ready to welcome you. The words stayed with Zelda as she finished her shopping and walked back toward the wagon camp. The sun was high and brutal, but she barely noticed, too lost in thought. She believed Ruth's assessment of Jackson, believed that he was a good man offering something genuine. But staying meant an enormous leap of faith, trusting her life to someone she barely knew. She was so preoccupied that she nearly walked past the small whitewashed building with a cross above the door. The church Ruth had mentioned, she realized. On impulse, she pushed open the door and stepped into the cool dimness within. The interior was simple but clean, with wooden pews and a modest altar. Zelda sat in the back row, breathing in the familiar smell of old wood and candle wax, and let herself be still. She had not been particularly religious before her parents' death, but in the aftermath of their loss, she had found comfort in the rituals and certainties of faith. "Help me know what to do," she whispered into the silence. "Help me see clearly." No divine voice answered, but as she sat in the quiet church, Zelda felt a gradual settling in her chest, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with truth. She thought of her parents, of how her father had always encouraged her to be brave, to trust her instincts. She thought of the life waiting in California, working on someone else's farm, forever grateful for the charity of distant relatives. And she thought of Jackson, of the way his eyes had lit up when he looked at her, of the careful respect he showed her uncle, of the home he was offering. When she finally left the church, the sun had moved considerably across the sky, and she knew what she was going to do. The knowing settled in her bones like something that had always been there, just waiting to be acknowledged. She found Jackson at the livery stable on the edge of town, currying his horse with long, methodical strokes. He looked up as she approached, hope and fear warring on his expressive face. "I need to ask you some questions," Zelda said without preamble, "and I need you to answer them honestly." "Anything," Jackson said, setting down his brush and giving her his full attention. "Where would I live if I stayed with me, if you would agree to marry me?" "Properly with a minister and everything legal." He took a breath. "I have a house on the Triple Bar Ranch. Nothing fancy, but it is solid and it is mine. 3 rooms and a good well. I have been fixing it up for the past year, making it into a real home. If you wanted changes, we could make them together." "What would my life look like? What would I do with my days?" "Whatever you wanted," Jackson said immediately. "If you wanted to help with the ranch work, there is always plenty to do. If you wanted to take in sewing or start a garden or get involved with the church, that would be your choice. I am not looking for a servant or a decoration, Zelda. I am looking for a partner, someone to build a life with. What about my aunt and uncle? I cannot just abandon them." "I already thought about that," Jackson said, and there was excitement creeping into his voice now, as though he dared to believe she might actually be considering this. "I talked to Frank Morrison this morning. He runs the dry goods store in town. His back has been giving him trouble, and he has been looking for someone to help manage the business. Your uncle's experience with the farm means he knows inventory and dealing with suppliers. It would not be charity. It would be real work with real pay. And the store comes with living quarters above it, small but clean and private." Zelda felt her eyes widen. He had really thought this through, had spent his time finding solutions to the exact obstacles that would have stopped her. "You did all that this morning." "I did not sleep much last night," Jackson admitted. "I kept thinking about what I could do to make this possible, to give you real reasons to stay instead of just my feelings. I know this is asking a lot, Zelda. I know it is fast and probably frightening. But I also know with everything I am that this is right, that we are right." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to smell horse and leather and something essentially him. "I am terrified," she said honestly. "So am I," he replied. "But I am more terrified of watching you leave and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been. If I do this, if I stay, I need you to understand something. I will not be a meek wife who just agrees with everything you say. I have opinions and ideas, and I will expect to be heard." A slow smile spread across Jackson's face, transforming it into something beautiful. "I would not want you any other way. I fell for your spirit as much as your face, Zelda O'Connell. I want all of you, including the parts that challenge me." "Then yes," she said, the word emerging with a certainty that surprised her. "Yes, I will stay. Yes, I will marry you. And yes, we are probably both completely out of our minds." Jackson let out a whoop of pure joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around in the dusty livery stable while his horse looked on with equine disinterest. When he set her down, they were both laughing, giddy with the enormity of what they were choosing. "I am going to make you so happy," Jackson promised, cupping her face in both hands. "I am going to spend every day of my life making sure you never regret this decision." "I am going to hold you to that," Zelda said, then rose on her toes and kissed him. It was her first real kiss, and it was everything the novels had promised and more. Jackson's lips were warm and gentle at first, tentative, asking permission. But when Zelda pressed closer, he deepened the kiss, pulling her against him with an urgency that spoke of the feelings he had been holding back. She felt it all through that kiss: his longing, his promise, his absolute commitment. And she answered with her own, pouring all her hope and fear and newfound love into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably stop before we scandalize the whole town." "Probably," Zelda agreed, but she did not move away. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other before reality intruded. "I need to tell my aunt and uncle," Zelda said. "This is going to be quite a shock." "Do you want me to come with you?" Jackson offered. She considered, then shook her head. "I think I need to talk to them alone first, but perhaps you could come later and speak with my uncle formally. It seems right to do things as properly as possible, given how improper the whole situation is." Jackson agreed, and they parted reluctantly, Zelda walking back toward the wagon camp with her heart pounding and her mind racing with everything she needed to say. She found her aunt and uncle sitting in the shade of their wagon, and they looked up with pleased surprise at her return. "We were starting to worry," Aunt Margaret said. "You were gone quite a while." "I need to talk to you both," Zelda said, sitting down across from them. "About the journey to California." Uncle Robert's expression grew serious. "You are having doubts. I thought so this morning." "Not doubts exactly. More like a different path revealed itself." She took a deep breath and laid it all out, meeting Jackson, the connection she felt, his proposal, and the opportunity for Uncle Robert at the dry goods store. She spoke quickly, trying to get it all out before her courage failed. When she finished, silence hung heavy in the air. Aunt Margaret looked genuinely shocked, her hand pressed to her chest. Uncle Robert's face was harder to read, his weathered features thoughtful. 2 days, Aunt Margaret finally said. "Zelda, this is madness. You have known this man for 2 days and you want to marry him." "I know how it sounds, Aunt Margaret, but I also know how I feel. And I know that if I get on that wagon train tomorrow, I will regret it for the rest of my life. What do we really know about this Jackson Northwood?" Her aunt pressed. "He could be anyone, could be lying about everything." "He is not," Uncle Robert said quietly, and both women turned to him in surprise. "I made inquiries this morning after your questions, Zelda. Talked to some of the men from town while getting the horses reshod. Jackson Northwood is exactly who he says he is. Works for the Triple Bar, has for years. Respected, honest, owns his own place. Every person I talked to had nothing but good things to say about him." "You knew?" Zelda asked, surprised. "I suspected." "You had that look your mother used to get when she talked about your father. That certainty that defies explanation." He smiled sadly. "I loved your mother like a sister, Zelda. She and your father had that same quick recognition, knew each other barely a month before they married. And they had 23 good years together before the fever took them, so I am not going to tell you that quick knowing cannot be real. Aunt Margaret made a distressed sound. Robert, you cannot be seriously considering this. What will we tell the family in California? They are expecting all three of us. We will tell them the truth, that our niece found love and a good man, and we chose to stay with her rather than continue on. He reached over and took his wife's hand. Margaret, you have been dreading this journey since we left Missouri. You have been sick almost every day, frightened of what comes next. The truth is, neither of us is young enough to be homesteading anymore. This opportunity at the dry goods store, if it is legitimate, could be exactly what we need. A chance to settle somewhere instead of always moving toward some uncertain future. But we do not know anyone here, Aunt Margaret protested weakly. We did not know anyone in California either, Uncle Robert pointed out gently. At least here we would have Zelda nearby. And from what I have heard, Globe is growing. Could be we would find it suits us better than we expected. Zelda watched the silent communication pass between her aunt and uncle, years of marriage allowing them to speak without words. Finally, Aunt Margaret sighed and looked at Zelda with worried but loving eyes. I cannot say I understand this, or that I am not terrified for you, but if this is truly what you want, we will not stop you. And if your uncle thinks staying is the right choice for us as well, then I suppose we are all staying in Arizona. Relief flooded through Zelda so powerfully that tears sprang to her eyes. She moved quickly to embrace both her aunt and uncle, gratitude overwhelming her. Thank you. Thank you for understanding, or at least for trying to. Just promise me one thing, Aunt Margaret said, pulling back to look Zelda in the eye. Promise me you will have a proper wedding with time for a dress and a minister and everything done right. Do not rush off to some justice of the peace in the middle of the night. I promise, Zelda said, laughing through her tears. Jackson wants to do everything properly too. He is planning to come speak with Uncle Robert this evening to ask formally for my hand. Uncle Robert harumphed but looked pleased. Good. Just because you young people are in a hurry does not mean we have to abandon all standards of decency. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Jackson arrived as promised that evening, dressed in clean clothes with his hair still damp from washing. He spoke with Uncle Robert privately, and though Zelda could not hear the conversation, she saw her uncle shake Jackson's hand at the end, his expression approving. News of Zelda's decision spread through the Wagon camp quickly, met with reactions ranging from romantic approval to scandalized disapproval. The Wagon train captain was understanding but firm. The train would leave on schedule tomorrow morning. Anyone choosing to stay behind did so at their own risk and could not expect assistance later. That night, Zelda helped her aunt and uncle sort through their possessions, deciding what to take to their new home above the dry goods store and what to sell or leave behind. It felt surreal, dismantling their traveling life and preparing to put down roots in a place they had never planned to stay. Are you afraid? Aunt Margaret asked quietly as they folded linens. Terrified, Zelda admitted. But also more certain than I have been about anything since my parents died. Does that make sense? Her aunt smiled, and for the first time since this all began, it reached her eyes. More than you might think, my dear. I felt much the same when I married your uncle. My parents thought he was too old for me, too set in his ways, but I knew, just like you know. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sky that impossible blue that seemed unique to the Arizona territory. The Wagon train prepared for departure, teams being hitched and final supplies loaded. Zelda stood with Jackson, watching as people she had traveled with for months prepared to continue a journey she would not complete. Some of the other travelers came to say goodbye, pressing small gifts into her hands and offering advice and blessings. Others avoided her, clearly disapproving of her choice. Zelda tried not to let the disapproval sting, focusing instead on the solid presence of Jackson beside her, his hand warm and reassuring in hers. The train captain came by for a final word. "You are sure about this, Miss O'Connell? Last chance to change your mind." "I am sure," Zelda said firmly. He nodded, tipped his hat, and moved on to complete his final checks. Within the hour, the wagons began to roll, wheels creaking and dust rising as the train pulled out of Globe and headed west. Zelda watched them go, feeling a strange mixture of loss and relief. That had been her future, rolling away into the distance. Now she would forge a different one entirely. "You all right?" Jackson asked softly. "Yes," she said, and meant it. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Uncle Robert met with Frank Morrison and accepted the position at the dry goods store, starting immediately to learn the inventory and business practices. The living quarters above the store were indeed small but clean, and Aunt Margaret threw herself into making them homelike with a determination that suggested she was more pleased with this turn of events than she had initially let on. Jackson introduced Zelda to the minister of the small church, Reverend Samuel Hughes, and arrangements were made for a wedding in 2 weeks' time. It would give Zelda time to have a proper dress made and for Jackson to make final preparations on their house. In the meantime, Zelda stayed with her aunt and uncle in the rooms above the store, observing propriety even as she spent every possible moment with Jackson, getting to know the man she was going to marry. They walked together through Globe's dusty streets, rode out to see the Triple Bar Ranch where Jackson worked, and sat on the porch of the dry goods store in the evenings, talking until the stars came out. She learned that Jackson had been born in Texas, that his mother had died when he was young, that he had come to Arizona 6 years ago looking for work and found a home instead. She learned that he loved horses, that he had a gift for working with animals that others had given up on, that he dreamed of eventually owning his own ranch where he could breed and train quality stock. He learned that Zelda loved to read, that she had a talent for sewing that had helped her family make ends meet back in Missouri, that she missed her parents with an ache that sometimes took her breath away. He learned that she had a quick wit and a quicker temper when roused, that she was not afraid of hard work, that she sang while she worked though she claimed to have a terrible voice. They learned each other's stories, habits, hopes, and fears. And with each revelation, the connection between them deepened, the initial spark of recognition growing into something more substantial and enduring. Ruth Palmer, the newspaper editor's wife Zelda had met in the general store, became a friend and guide, introducing Zelda to other women in town and helping her navigate the social landscape of Globe. Through Ruth, Zelda met the school teacher, the doctor's wife, and several other women who were working to bring civilization to this rough mining town. "You will fit in well here," Ruth said as they worked together on Zelda's wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown of cream-colored cotton. "Globe needs women who are not afraid of challenges, who can see the potential in what we are building." "It is so different from what I imagined my life would be," Zelda admitted, carefully stitching lace to the bodice. "A month ago, I thought I would be working in orange groves in California. And now you will be married to a cowboy in an Arizona mining town. Life has a way of surprising us." Ruth paused in her sewing to look at Zelda seriously. "But you are happy with this choice? No regrets?" "None," Zelda said immediately. "Sometimes I cannot believe this is real, that I found this kind of connection with someone. But regrets? No, Jackson is everything I did not know I was looking for. The 2 weeks before the wedding passed quickly, filled with preparations and introductions and the practical work of combining two lives. Jackson brought Zelda to see the house he had prepared, a sturdy adobe structure with a red tile roof and views of the surrounding hills. It was simple but well made, with a main room that served as kitchen and living space, a bedroom, and a small additional room that Jackson said they could use however they wanted. "It is not much," he said, watching her face anxiously as she explored the space. "It is perfect," Zelda said honestly. The house had good bones and good light, and she could already see how they would make it a home together. "We can add curtains and maybe some shelves for books, and that room could be a sewing room at least until—" She trailed off, blushing. "Until we need it for a nursery," Jackson finished, pulling her close. "I want that, Zelda. A family with you, children who grow up knowing they are loved and wanted." "So do I," she whispered, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. This man, this life, this future. It all felt right in a way nothing else ever had. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather, the November air cool and crisp, the sky a brilliant blue dome overhead. Zelda dressed in her new gown with Aunt Margaret's help, her auburn hair pinned up with wildflowers that Ruth had helped her gather. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the happy, glowing woman staring back. "Your mother would be so proud," Aunt Margaret said, tears in her eyes. "You look beautiful, my dear." The church was full when Zelda arrived, which surprised her given how recently she had come to town. But Jackson was well liked, and curiosity about his sudden engagement had drawn many of Globe's residents. She saw faces she recognized from the past 2 weeks. Ruth and her husband, Frank Morrison from the dry goods store, several of the ranch hands from the Triple Bar, and many others who had welcomed her into their community. But she only had eyes for Jackson, waiting at the altar in a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. His face when he saw her walking down the aisle was everything she could have hoped for: wonder and love and absolute certainty. Uncle Robert walked her forward, his limp barely noticeable as he proudly escorted his niece to her future. He placed her hand in Jackson's with visible emotion, then stepped back to stand with Aunt Margaret. Reverend Hughes performed the ceremony with warmth and sincerity, speaking of love and commitment and the courage it takes to build a life together. Zelda and Jackson spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, meaning every word. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed her with a sweetness that made her heart ache in the best possible way. The celebration afterward was held at the hotel dining room, the largest space available in Globe. Someone had decorated with autumn leaves and candles, and there was food and music and dancing. Zelda danced with Jackson, with her uncle, with Frank Morrison and several of the other men from town. She laughed and talked and felt embraced by this community that had been strangers just weeks ago. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued, Jackson leaned close and whispered, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Northwood?" The name sent a thrill through her. Mrs. Northwood, her new identity, her new life. "Yes," she said, "I am ready." They slipped away from the party, stealing out into the cool November night. Jackson had borrowed a wagon for the occasion, and he helped Zelda up onto the seat before climbing up beside her. The drive to their house took 20 minutes, following a road that was more suggestion than reality, but Zelda did not mind. She sat close to her husband, his arm around her shoulders, and watched the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The house was dark when they arrived, but Jackson had left lamps ready to light. He swept Zelda up into his arms at the threshold, carrying her over it with traditional care, and she laughed at the ceremony of it all, even as her heart raced at what came next. Inside, he set her down gently and lit the lamps, warm light filling the space they would share. They stood looking at each other for a long moment, and Zelda saw her own nervousness and anticipation reflected in Jackson's face. "I know we are married now," he said quietly, "but I do not want to rush you into anything you are not ready for. We can take this as slow as you need." She loved him for that, for his consideration and respect, but she also knew her own mind. "I am ready, Jackson. I want this. I want you." He crossed to her in 2 strides, cupping her face and kissing her with a passion he had held carefully in check until now. Zelda responded in kind, pouring all her love and desire into the kiss, letting her hands explore the solid warmth of him. They made their way to the bedroom, shedding clothes and inhibitions, discovering each other with touches that were sometimes tentative, sometimes bold, but always loving. Their wedding night was everything it should have been. Tender and awkward and perfect, 2 people learning the intimate language of love, figuring out how to move together, how to bring each other pleasure, how to be vulnerable and strong at the same time. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Zelda's head on Jackson's chest, his fingers trailing through her unbound hair. "I love you," Jackson said into the darkness. "I know I have not said it enough today with all the excitement, but I do. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person." "I love you too," Zelda replied, the words coming easily because they were so absolutely true. "Thank you for convincing me to stay behind. Thank you for being brave enough to do it," he countered. "I know what it cost you to take that leap of faith." They talked quietly into the night, making plans and sharing dreams until sleep finally claimed them both, wrapped safe in each other's arms. The early days of their marriage settled into a comfortable rhythm. Jackson returned to his work at the Triple Bar, leaving before dawn and returning at sunset, while Zelda established their home and began to integrate herself into the life of Globe. She took in sewing, her skill with a needle quickly earning her a reputation, and she became involved with the church and the informal women's group that Ruth Palmer organized. The work was hard, the conditions often harsh, but Zelda found herself happier than she had been in years. There was a satisfaction in building something from nothing, in being part of a community that was actively shaping its future. And there was Jackson, her husband, who came home each night tired and dusty, but always with time for her, always making her feel cherished and valued. Winter in Arizona was nothing like winter in Missouri. There was cold, certainly, but also brilliant sunshine and clear skies. Zelda learned to adapt to the different rhythm of seasons, to appreciate the stark beauty of the desert landscape. She and Jackson developed their own traditions. Sunday rides to explore the surrounding country, Friday evenings playing cards with Ruth and her husband, quiet mornings when they could sleep late wrapped around each other. By February, Zelda began to suspect she might be pregnant. The signs were subtle at first, but having helped her mother through pregnancies with younger siblings who had not survived infancy, she recognized them. She waited until she was certain before telling Jackson, wanting to be sure. She chose a Saturday evening when he was relaxed and happy after a particularly good day at the ranch. They had just finished dinner, and he was reading by lamplight while she worked on mending. She set down her sewing and took a deep breath. "Jackson, I have something to tell you." He looked up immediately, always attuned to shifts in her tone. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong, quite the opposite, actually." She moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. "I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." The expression that crossed his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Shock transforming into joy, transforming into wonder. "A baby, truly, you are sure?" as sure as I can be. I have not seen the doctor yet, but all the signs are there. If I am right, the baby should come in September. Jackson let out a whoop and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. A baby, he kept repeating. We are going to be parents. Are you happy? Zelda asked, even though his reaction made the answer obvious. Happy does not even begin to cover it, Jackson said, pulling back to look at her with shining eyes. You have given me everything, Zelda. A home, a partnership, and now this. I cannot believe how blessed I am. They went to see Dr. Harrison the next week, and he confirmed what Zelda already knew. She was healthy, and the pregnancy appeared to be progressing normally. He gave her instructions for care and told her to come back monthly for examinations. The months that followed were a study in anticipation and preparation. Jackson became absurdly protective, trying to stop Zelda from doing anything he considered too strenuous, which was nearly everything. She had to gently but firmly remind him that she was pregnant, not ill, and that women had been working through pregnancy since the beginning of time. I know that, he said, looking sheepish, but you are not just any woman. You are my wife carrying my child, and the thought of anything happening to either of you terrifies me. His vulnerability touched her, and she softened her response. Nothing is going to happen to us. I am strong and healthy, and I will be careful. But I also need to keep living my life, Jackson. I cannot spend the next 6 months sitting still. They found a compromise, with Zelda agreeing to reduce her sewing workload and let Jackson handle more of the heavy household tasks, while he accepted that she would continue her normal activities within reason. Together, they prepared the small room in their house as a nursery, painting the walls a sunny yellow and building a cradle from wood that Jackson carefully selected and sanded smooth. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Robert were thrilled at the prospect of becoming great-aunt and great-uncle. They had settled well into life in Globe, with Uncle Robert proving to have a real talent for managing the dry goods store. Frank Morrison had taken to spending more time with his grandchildren in Tucson, leaving the day-to-day operations increasingly in Uncle Robert's capable hands. As summer arrived and Zelda's pregnancy became obvious, she found herself embraced by the women of Globe in a new way. They shared advice and old remedies, offered hand-me-down baby clothes, and promised to be available when her time came. The community that had seemed so foreign 7 months ago now felt like family. Jackson grew more excited and more nervous as September approached. He read every book on childbirth and infant care that Dr. Harrison could provide, asking so many questions that the doctor finally laughed and told him to trust that women had been doing this successfully for millennia. The baby came on a warm September evening, 2 weeks before the expected date. Zelda's labor started in the late afternoon, and Jackson immediately sent for Dr. Harrison and Ruth Palmer, then paced the main room of their house like a caged animal while the women attended to his wife. Zelda's labor was long but not unusually difficult. Ruth held her hand and coached her through the contractions while Dr. Harrison managed the medical aspects. Through the pain and exhaustion, Zelda kept her focus on the goal, meeting the child she and Jackson had created, bringing new life into the world. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the baby arrived with a lusty cry that brought tears of relief to everyone present. Dr. Harrison placed the squalling infant on Zelda's chest, and she looked down at her son with overwhelming love. "It is a boy," Ruth said, smiling. "A healthy, perfect boy." Jackson was allowed in then, and he approached the bed with visible awe, staring at his wife and newborn son as though he could not quite believe they were real. "He is beautiful," he whispered. "You are both so beautiful." "Would you like to hold your son?" Zelda asked, and carefully transferred the baby into Jackson's arms. Her husband held the infant with extreme care, his rough cowboy hands gentle and sure as they cradled the tiny body. "Hello there, little one," he murmured. "I am your papa. I have been waiting to meet you." They named him James Robert Northwood, after Jackson's father and Zelda's uncle. Baby James proved to have his father's dark hair and what would eventually be his mother's green eyes. He was healthy and vocal, making his needs known with impressive volume. The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Zelda had thought she understood tired before, but caring for a newborn brought a whole new definition to the word. Jackson helped as much as his work allowed, walking the floor with James in the evenings, changing diapers without complaint, and bringing Zelda meals when she was too absorbed in nursing to remember to eat. "I had no idea it would be this hard," Jackson admitted one night after they had finally gotten James to sleep. "Or this amazing. I could watch him for hours." "I do watch him for hours," Zelda said with tired amusement. "That is pretty much all I do. I know, and you are incredible." He pulled her close, careful not to wake the baby sleeping in the cradle beside their bed. "I fall more in love with you every day, watching you be a mother to our son." As James grew from infant to baby, their lives expanded and shifted to accommodate this new person. Jackson received a promotion at the Triple Bar, becoming the head wrangler with a significant increase in pay. It meant more responsibility but also more security, and he began seriously saving toward his dream of owning his own ranch someday. Zelda's sewing business had slowed during her pregnancy and the first months of James's life, but as he became more independent, she was able to resume taking in work. She discovered she could sew while James played nearby, and the extra income was always welcome. Uncle Robert's health, never robust after his farming accident, began to decline slowly over the next year. It was nothing dramatic, just a gradual slowing, a little less energy each month. Frank Morrison, seeing the writing on the wall, offered to sell the dry goods store to Uncle Robert at a generous price that could be paid over time. With Jackson's help and advice, Uncle Robert accepted, becoming a business owner at age 62. "Never thought I would own anything again after we lost the farm," he told Zelda one Sunday afternoon as they all gathered for dinner. "But here I am, a shopkeeper in Arizona. Life is strange. Strange but good," Zelda said, bouncing a fussy James on her hip. "We have all found something here we would not have found in California. That cowboy of yours was the best thing that ever happened to this family," Uncle Robert said with a fond look at Jackson. "Even if I did nearly have heart failure when you announced you were staying behind to marry him." Time continued its steady march forward. James took his first steps, spoke his first words, grew from baby to toddler with astonishing speed. Globe continued to grow and develop, gaining a proper school and a second church and enough families that it was beginning to feel like a real town rather than a rough mining camp. When James was 2 years old, Zelda found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was harder, with more sickness and fatigue than she had experienced with James. Dr. Harrison monitored her carefully, and Jackson went back to his protective hovering, though he had learned to do it with more subtlety than before. Their daughter, Emily Grace, arrived in May on a day when spring wildflowers carpeted the hills around Globe. Her birth was faster than James's had been, and she emerged into the world with a quiet alertness that was the opposite of her brother's vocal entrance. She had Zelda's auburn hair and Jackson's dark eyes, and James was immediately fascinated by his baby sister. With 2 children, their little house felt much smaller. Jackson began talking seriously about building a larger place, maybe on a piece of land he could purchase, rather than continuing to live on Triple Bar property. The ranch owner, seeing Jackson's talent and dedication, made him a partner in a new venture breeding horses, giving Jackson both a stake in the business and the capital to pursue his dreams. By the time Emily was 1 and James was 3, Jackson had saved enough to purchase 40 acres on the outskirts of Globe with water access and good grazing. He spent every spare moment building a new house there, larger than their current home, with room for their growing family and the future he was working toward. The whole community seemed to take an interest in the project. Men from the Triple Bar helped with the heavy construction during their off hours. Women from town came out with food and advice. Uncle Robert donated materials from the store at cost. It was a tangible reminder of how integrated they had become into this place, how Globe had truly become home. They moved into the new house when Emily was 18 months old, and Zelda cried when she saw how Jackson had incorporated all the little details she had mentioned over the years. A large kitchen with good light for her sewing, a porch that wrapped around 2 sides for cool evening sitting, built-in shelves in the main room for the books they had been collecting. "You built this for us," she said, looking around at the spacious rooms and solid construction. "You built us a real home." "We built it," Jackson corrected. "You and me together, with help from everyone who cares about us. That is what makes it a home, Zelda. Not the walls, but the people and the love." Life in the new house fell into a comfortable pattern. Jackson's horse breeding venture proved successful, with buyers coming from as far as New Mexico for the quality animals he was producing. Zelda continued her sewing and became increasingly involved in the community, helping establish a lending library and organizing social events that brought people together. James started school when he was 6, proving to be bright and curious like his mother, with his father's quiet determination. Emily was more reserved than her brother, thoughtful and observant, but with a stubborn streak that kept everyone on their toes. Uncle Robert died peacefully in his sleep when James was 7 and Emily was 5. He had been slowing down for months, his body simply wearing out after a long and full life. At his funeral, half the town turned out to pay respects to a man who had become a fixture of the community, always fair in his dealings and kind to everyone. Aunt Margaret grieved deeply, but found comfort in her family, spending increasing amounts of time at Zelda and Jackson's home, doting on her great-niece and great-nephew. With Uncle Robert gone, she sold the dry goods store and moved into a small house Jackson built for her near their own, becoming a permanent part of their daily life. As the years passed and the children grew, Zelda sometimes thought back to that August day in 1883, when a cowboy had noticed a cracked wagon axle and changed her entire life. She thought about the wagon train continuing to California without her, wondered occasionally what would have become of her if she had made that journey. But those thoughts never lasted long, dismissed by the reality of the life she had chosen. A husband who still made her heart race after years of marriage, children who filled their days with joy and chaos, a community where she belonged. Jackson proved to be exactly the man he had promised to be that day, in the livery stable. He made her happy every single day, sometimes in grand gestures but more often in small moments. The way he still kissed her goodbye every morning even after 15 years of marriage, the way he listened when she talked about her day, the way he played with their children with wholehearted enthusiasm, the way he looked at her across the dinner table as though she was still the most fascinating person in the world. When James was 12 and Emily was 10, Zelda surprised Jackson with the news that she was pregnant again. They had assumed their family was complete, had grown comfortable with the rhythm of life with 2 increasingly independent children. A baby at this stage felt both daunting and exciting. "Are you happy about this?" Zelda asked, watching Jackson's face for his reaction. He pulled her close, his hand coming to rest on her still flat stomach. "I am always happy about anything that comes from our love. This baby is a gift, Zelda. An unexpected one maybe, but a gift nonetheless." Their third child, a boy they named Thomas Jackson, arrived just before Zelda's 40th birthday. James and Emily were old enough to be genuinely helpful rather than just additional work, and they both took to their baby brother with protective devotion. Having a baby in the house again brought new energy and joy, reminding Zelda and Jackson of how far they had come since those early days of their marriage. The years continued to roll forward, bringing changes and growth. James grew into a young man with his father's talent for working with horses and his mother's quick mind. He started working alongside Jackson, learning the business and proving to have inherited his father's gift. Emily showed artistic talent, spending hours drawing and painting the landscapes around Globe, capturing the stark beauty of the Arizona territory. Thomas was different from either of his siblings, outgoing and charismatic where James was quiet and Emily was reserved. He seemed to collect friends wherever he went, always organizing games and adventures, always at the center of whatever was happening. Globe continued to evolve as well. The mining industry had its ups and downs, but the town proved resilient, diversifying and growing. The rough edges softened over time, replaced by churches and schools and established businesses. The Arizona territory was changing, moving toward eventual statehood, becoming more settled even as it retained its essential Western character. Jackson and Zelda's marriage deepened and matured over the years, moving through the stages of early passion to companionate partnership, to something richer and more complex than either could have imagined. They had weathered difficulties together, financial setbacks, childhood illnesses that terrified them, conflicts and disagreements that had to be worked through. But through it all, the fundamental connection that had brought them together remained strong. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Jackson took Zelda back to Globe proper, to the spot where the wagon train had camped all those years ago. It was much changed now, buildings where there had been open ground, streets where there had been rough tracks. "You ever regret it?" Jackson asked, holding her hand as they looked around at how different everything was. "Giving up California to stay here with me?" Zelda turned to face him, this man who had convinced her to take the biggest risk of her life, and smiled. "Not for a single moment. You gave me everything I did not even know I wanted. A true partnership, a family, a home where I belong. California could never have given me that because California did not have you." He kissed her there in the middle of town, not caring who saw, and she kissed him back with all the love and passion and absolute certainty she had felt at 22 and still felt at 42. James married at 22 to a school teacher from Phoenix who had come to Globe for a position at the expanding school. The wedding was a joyful affair, held at the church where Jackson and Zelda had married, bringing together the entire community. Watching her son exchange vows, Zelda was transported back to her own wedding day, remembering how nervous and certain she had been. Emily, surprising everyone, decided to pursue her art seriously, going to study in San Francisco. Letting her daughter go was one of the hardest things Zelda had ever done, but Jackson reminded her that they had raised their children to be independent, to follow their dreams. Emily wrote regularly, her letters full of descriptions of the city and the art she was creating, and visited when she could. Thomas, true to his sociable nature, became involved in local politics as he grew older, passionate about issues affecting the territory and working toward statehood. He had his father's fundamental decency and his mother's quick thinking, and people responded to his genuine desire to make things better. Aunt Margaret lived to see all three of her great-niece and nephews reach adulthood, passing away peacefully at age 87. She had become such a fixture in their lives that her loss left a palpable hole, but her presence remained in the values she had instilled, and the memories they all cherished. As Jackson and Zelda entered their 50s, they found themselves with a different kind of freedom. The children were grown and pursuing their own paths. The horse breeding business ran smoothly, with James managing much of the day-to-day operations. They had time again for just each other, for long rides into the hills, for quiet evenings on the porch, for rediscovering the connection that had started everything. James and his wife gave them their first grandchild when Zelda was 53. A girl with auburn hair they named Zelda Margaret. Holding her namesake, Zelda felt the beautiful continuity of life, the way love and family extended forward into the future. More grandchildren followed over the years. Emily eventually married an artist she met in San Francisco and had twin boys. Thomas married late, at 32, to a widow with 2 children of her own, and they added 2 more to the blended family. The house that Jackson had built became a gathering place for the expanding family, especially on holidays when it filled with children and laughter, and the beautiful chaos of multiple generations together. Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, and Globe celebrated with parades and speeches. Thomas was there in the thick of it, having been elected to the territorial legislature in its final term and working to establish the framework for the new state government. Watching him speak passionately about the future, Zelda felt immense pride in the man he had become. As they grew older, Jackson's body showed the wear of a lifetime of hard physical work. His hands, once so strong and sure, developed arthritis that made detailed work difficult. But he adapted, focusing on the breeding program's strategic direction while James handled the physical demands. Zelda's eyes weakened, making sewing increasingly difficult, but she had built enough of a reputation that she could be selective about projects, taking only work that interested her. They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends old and new. Looking around at the gathering, at the life they had built from a single impulsive decision made in the span of 2 days, Zelda felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That night, when the party was over and they were alone in the house they had shared for so many years, Jackson pulled her close in their bed, the gesture as natural as breathing after decades together. "You know what I was thinking today?" he asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "What is that?" "That if I had to do it all over again, I would not change a single thing. Every moment, every decision, every challenge, it all led us here, to this life we built together. Even the hard parts," Zelda asked. "The times when money was tight or the children were sick, or we fought so badly we could barely speak to each other. Especially those parts," Jackson said firmly. "Because we got through them together. They made us stronger, made our marriage stronger. I would not trade any of it." Zelda shifted to look at her husband's face, still handsome to her despite the lines and gray hair. "I saw you that first day and I knew," she said. "I did not understand what I knew, could not have explained it, but some part of me recognized you as mine." "And I saw you and knew I could not let you leave," Jackson replied. "Best decision I ever made, convincing you to stay behind. Best decision I ever made, letting myself be convinced." They kissed then, a kiss that held 40 years of history, of love and passion and partnership and commitment. They made love slowly, tenderly, their bodies knowing each other as intimately as their hearts and minds did, finding pleasure and connection in the physical expression of their enduring bond. The years continued to advance, as years do, bringing both joys and sorrows. They buried old friends and welcomed new grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Globe continued to grow and change around them, but their house remained a constant, a touchstone for their family. Jackson's health began to decline noticeably when he was in his early 70s. Nothing dramatic, just a general weakening, a slowing down. He spent more time in his chair on the porch, watching the horses in the pasture, and less time actively working. James ran the breeding operation entirely now, doing an excellent job and expanding it in new directions. Zelda remained relatively healthy, her mind sharp even as her body aged. She spent her time with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on stories of the family's history, making sure the younger generations understood where they came from and how they got here. On a warm evening in early September, 52 years after they had first met, Jackson and Zelda sat together on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. He had been quiet all day, more reflective than usual, and Zelda sensed he was gathering his thoughts. "I have had a good life," Jackson said finally, reaching for her hand. "Better than I ever imagined possible, and it is all because you were brave enough to take a chance on a cowboy you barely knew." "You say that as though you are saying goodbye," Zelda said, fear suddenly clutching at her heart. "Not yet," Jackson assured her, squeezing her hand. "But I am 75 years old, Zelda. I have lived longer than most men who work like I have. I just wanted to make sure you know that every single day with you has been a gift. That loving you and being loved by you has been the greatest privilege of my life." Tears filled Zelda's eyes. "You are the love of my life, Jackson Northwood, the only love of my life. Whatever time we have left, whether it is years or days, I will cherish every moment." They sat together until full dark, hands clasped, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Arizona sky. Around them, their land stretched away into the darkness, the home they had built and the life they had created. It had all started with a cracked wagon axle and a cowboy brave enough to ask a stranger to stay behind. From that small beginning had grown this expansive life, this family, this legacy of love. Jackson lived another 3 years, dying peacefully in his sleep at 78 with Zelda beside him. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Family, friends, business associates, people whose lives he had touched over nearly 8 decades. The stories people told painted a picture of a man who was honest, hardworking, fair in his dealings, and devoted to his family above all else. Zelda grieved deeply, as one does when losing a partner of 55 years. But she also felt grateful for the time they had been given, for the life they had built, for the family that remained to carry on their legacy. She lived another 7 years after Jackson's death, remaining in their home, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, always ready with stories about the cowboy who had convinced her to stay behind. She died at 87 on a cool November morning, sitting in the chair on the porch where she and Jackson had spent so many evenings together. Emily, visiting from San Francisco, found her there, a peaceful expression on her face as though she had simply decided it was time to go find Jackson again. At her funeral, Thomas spoke about his mother's courage in choosing an uncertain future with a stranger over the security of a planned life. James talked about the partnership his parents had modeled, the way they had built everything together, as equals. Emily read from her mother's journal, entries about that fateful August in 1883 when Zelda's life had changed direction completely. The family buried Zelda beside Jackson on a hill overlooking the land they had built their life on. The headstones were simple but solid, just like the people they marked, bearing their names and years and the inscription, Together they built a legacy of love. In the years that followed, as the 20th century progressed, and the world changed in ways Jackson and Zelda could never have imagined, their descendants spread across Arizona and beyond. But Globe remained the heart of the family, and the house Jackson built remained standing, renovated and maintained by various family members, a physical reminder of where it all started. James's grandchildren, knowing the story by heart, would sometimes stand on the spot in Globe where the wagon train had camped in 1883 and try to imagine what it must have been like. Their great-great-grandmother, young and grieving, facing an uncertain future. Their great-great-grandfather, a cowboy with a dream and the courage to speak it aloud. Two people who barely knew each other making a choice that would echo through generations. The story became family legend, told and retold, growing in the telling but always maintaining its essential truth. That sometimes love arrives unexpectedly, that sometimes the best decisions are the ones that make no logical sense. That courage means being willing to step into the unknown when your heart tells you it is right. And at the center of it all was the image that started everything. A cowboy noticing a cracked wagon axle, a woman brave enough to stay behind, and a love that built not just a marriage but a legacy that would endure for generations. In a very real way, every descendant of Jackson and Zelda Northwood owed their existence to that moment of connection, that leap of faith, that choice to believe in something bigger than fear or logic. Their story became the foundation upon which the family built its identity. A reminder that home is not always where you plan to end up, that family can be found in unexpected places, and that the greatest adventures often begin with a stranger asking you to stay.